Quiet Mind Stories. Tonight we're exploring something many people experience after the lights go out. You lie down to sleep. The room becomes quiet. Your body slowly begins to relax. And then, without warning, a conversation from earlier in the day quietly returns. Something you said, something someone else said, a sentence you suddenly wish you had phrased differently, a moment that seemed completely ordinary when it happened. Yet now the mind begins replaying it again and again. Sometimes the scene becomes clearer than it ever felt during the day. Every word returns, every tone of voice, even small details you barely noticed at the time. You may find yourself wondering why the mind chooses this exact moment to revisit the past. Why these memories appear when everything around you has become still. During the daytime, the brain is constantly busy processing information, conversations, movement, notifications, tasks that demand attention. All of this activity keeps deeper reflections slightly below the surface. But night changes the rhythm of the mind. As the environment becomes quiet, the brain finally has space to process unfinished experiences. Psychologists often describe this as the mind's natural attempt to organize emotional information. The brain begins reviewing moments that carried even a small emotional signal, not to punish you, not to embarrass you, but simply to understand what happened. Human memory is not just a recording system. It is also a learning system, and learning often happens when the world becomes quiet enough to reflect. Which is why conversations that seemed unimportant during the day can return later in the darkness. The mind begins examining tone, meaning, intent, even the smallest pause in someone's voice. From the outside, it may feel like unnecessary overthinking, but from the brain's perspective, it is a form of social analysis. Humans are deeply wired to understand how others perceive them. For most of human history, social acceptance was closely connected to survival. Because of this, the brain developed powerful systems for reviewing social interactions. And sometimes those systems become most active at night. When the mind begins replaying a conversation at night, it can feel as if something has gone wrong inside the brain. You may lie there wondering why the same moment keeps returning, why a single sentence suddenly feels important, or why your thoughts refuse to move on to something else. But from a psychological perspective, this behavior is not unusual at all. In fact, it is connected to one of the brain's most important functions: understanding social experiences. Human beings are deeply social creatures. For thousands of years, survival depended on being accepted by the people around us. Living in a group meant protection, cooperation, and shared resources. But it also meant that small social signals carried real importance. A misunderstanding could affect relationships. A poorly timed comment might create tension. Because of this, the brain evolved powerful systems designed to monitor social interactions. These systems constantly ask quiet questions. Did that moment go well? Did the other person understand what I meant? Could that situation have been handled differently? Most of the time, these questions remain in the background during the day. There is simply too much happening for the brain to stop and analyze every interaction. But when night arrives, the environment changes dramatically. The world becomes quieter. External stimulation begins to fade. Lights dim. Screens turn off. conversations end. As the brain moves towards sleep, attention slowly shifts inward. And this is when unfinished thoughts often become easier to notice. Psychologists sometimes describe this state as a period of mental processing. The brain begins reviewing experiences from earlier in the day. It quietly sorts memories. It evaluates emotional signals. And it attempts to understand moments that were left unresolved. A conversation that seemed ordinary during the afternoon might suddenly feel more complex when the mind returns to it later, not because the event itself changed, but because the brain finally has enough silence to examine it. In this sense, replaying conversations can be seen as the mind's way of learning from social experience. The brain is simply trying to understand the meaning behind what happened, and night provides the perfect environment for this kind of reflection. Another reason conversations return so strongly at night has to do with how the brain processes emotional information. During the day, most experiences move through the mind very quickly. A conversation happens. You respond. Then attention shifts to the next task almost immediately. Because of this constant movement, the brain does not always fully process the emotional meaning of each interaction right away. Instead, many experiences are temporarily stored for later evaluation. This is where nighttime processing becomes important. As the body prepares for sleep, the brain gradually transitions through different stages of relaxation. Heart rate slows, breathing becomes deeper, and external awareness begins to soften. In this quieter state, the brain naturally begins organizing memories from the day. Some of these memories are simple and pass quickly through the mind, but others carry a slightly stronger emotional signal. Perhaps a moment of uncertainty, a brief feeling of embarrassment, or a small question about how something you said may have been interpreted. Even when these feelings were subtle during the day, they can become more noticeable when the mind begins reviewing them later. This is partly because the brain is trying to refine social understanding. Human communication is complex. Much of what people express is not contained only in words. Tone of voice matters. Timing matters. Facial expressions matter. Even silence can carry meaning. Because of this complexity, the brain often revisits conversations to search for deeper patterns. It quietly analyzes what was said, how it was said, and what the other person might have felt in response. This process is not always comfortable. From the outside, it can feel like unnecessary overthinking, but internally the brain treats it as a form of social learning. It is attempting to improve future interactions, which means the mind sometimes studies the past in order to prepare for the future. At night, when distractions disappear, this learning system can become surprisingly active. A simple conversation may suddenly feel important enough for the brain to examine more closely. And once the mind begins analyzing a moment, it may replay the scene several times, each replay slightly adjusting the interpretation, each pass searching for meaning, until eventually the brain decides it has gathered enough understanding to move on. To understand why the mind replays conversations so vividly at night, it helps to look at how the brain handles uncertainty. Human beings are naturally sensitive to situations that feel unresolved. When an experience leaves a small question behind, the mind often tries to complete the picture. This is sometimes called the brain's search for closure. During a conversation, Many subtle signals are exchanged between people. Words are only one part of communication. Tone, pauses, facial expressions, and timing all carry meaning as well. Because these signals happen quickly, the brain does not always fully interpret them in the moment. Instead, it gathers pieces of information and stores them for later understanding. Later, when the mind has more quiet space to reflect, those pieces can be examined more carefully. Night time often becomes the perfect moment for this process. Without the constant movement of daytime activity, attention naturally turns inward. Thoughts slow down. The environment becomes still, and the brain begins revisiting interactions that contained even a small amount of uncertainty. Perhaps someone responded more slowly than expected. Maybe their tone sounded slightly different. Or perhaps a joke you made received a quieter reaction than you anticipated. Even small details like these can leave the mind wondering, not because something went wrong, but because the brain is designed to notice subtle social signals. When the mind begins reviewing a moment like this, it often tries to reconstruct the situation. It recalls the words that were spoken. It imagines how the other person might have interpreted them. It replays the scene from several angles, each time searching for a clearer explanation. This replay process is not always logical. The brain may exaggerate certain details. It may imagine possibilities that never actually occurred, but the purpose remains the same. The mind is trying to complete an unfinished social puzzle, and until the brain feels satisfied with its interpretation, the memory can continue returning. Night simply provides the quiet environment where this internal investigation becomes easier to notice. Another reason the mind returns to conversations at night is connected to how human memory prioritizes social experiences. Among all the information the brain processes each day, interactions with other people often carry the strongest emotional signals. A brief conversation may appear simple on the surface, yet beneath it, the brain is quietly tracking many layers of meaning. It notices tone of voice. It observes facial expressions. It registers pauses, reactions, and shifts in energy during the exchange. Even when we are not consciously aware of these details, the brain records them carefully. This happens because social understanding has always been essential for human survival. For most of human history, living in a group meant safety. Relationships determined access to support, cooperation, and shared protection. Because of this, the brain developed powerful systems that constantly evaluate social interactions. It tries to understand how others responded to us. It searches for signals that might reveal acceptance, disagreement, approval, or discomfort. During the day, however, this system often works in the background. Life moves quickly. New conversations replace old ones. Tasks demand attention. Notifications interrupt thought. As a result, many interactions are only partially processed in the moment they occur. The brain simply stores them for later reflection. When night time arrives, the environment becomes dramatically different. External stimulation decreases. Movement slows. The mind begins shifting away from the outside world and toward internal awareness. In this quieter state, previously stored social memories can begin returning to the surface. A conversation that felt ordinary during the day may suddenly feel important enough to review more carefully. The brain begins reconstructing the situation. It recalls the tone of the voices involved. It revisits the sequence of responses, and it begins asking quiet questions about what the interaction may have meant. Did the other person fully understand what was said? Was there something left unsaid? Could the moment have unfolded differently? These questions are not necessarily signs of anxiety or insecurity. Often they are simply the brain attempting to improve future communication. By revisiting past interactions, the mind gradually refines its ability to navigate complex social situations. Nighttime provides the silence that allows this learning process to unfold. And because the mind now has fewer distractions competing for attention, these memories can appear unusually vivid. Another interesting reason conversations replay at night is connected to the brain's tendency to strengthen memories that contain even a small emotional signal. Throughout the day, the mind experiences hundreds of different events. Most of them pass through awareness quickly and disappear just as quickly. But certain moments leave a slightly stronger imprint. These are often moments that involve other people. Perhaps a comment that felt unexpected, a brief moment of awkward silence, a reaction that was difficult to interpret. Even when these moments are small, the brain often marks them as socially important. This happens because human relationships are extremely complex systems. Unlike simple tasks or routines, social interactions rarely follow clear rules. The meaning behind a conversation can depend on subtle details. Tone can change the interpretation of a sentence. Timing can change the emotional impact of a response. Even the smallest shift in facial expression can alter how a message is received. Because of this complexity, the brain frequently revisits social experiences in order to refine its understanding of them. During the day, this reflection is limited by constant distractions. Attention moves rapidly between different responsibilities. The mind rarely has enough quiet space to fully examine a conversation from multiple perspectives. But nighttime provides a completely different environment. When the outside world becomes still, the brain gradually shifts its attention inward. Without constant external stimulation, internal thoughts become easier to notice. Memories that were quietly stored during the day can now begin rising back into awareness. At this stage, the brain often starts reconstructing the earlier interaction in greater detail. It may replay the sequence of the conversation. It may reconsider the tone of each response. It may imagine how the other person might have interpreted certain words. This process can feel frustrating when you are trying to fall asleep. Yet from the brain's perspective, it is part of a natural learning mechanism. By revisiting social experiences, the mind slowly improves its ability to understand complex human communication. Each replay offers another opportunity to examine the situation from a slightly different angle. Eventually, the brain gathers enough information to feel that the experience has been properly understood. And once that sense of understanding appears, the mind is usually able to let the memory settle again. Nighttime reflection, although sometimes uncomfortable, is often the brain's quiet attempt to make sense of the social world. Another important reason conversations replay at night is connected to the brain's natural desire to understand social meaning more clearly. Human communication rarely consists only of the words that are spoken. Most conversations contain many layers of subtle signals that unfold at the same time. A sentence might sound simple on the surface, yet tone, rhythm, and expression can quietly change the emotional meaning behind it. Because these signals appear so quickly during a conversation, the brain often registers them without fully interpreting them in the moment. Instead, it collects the information and stores it temporarily. Later, when the mind becomes quieter, the brain begins reviewing these details more carefully. Nighttime often provides the perfect environment for this kind of reflection. The outside world slows down, movement fades, sounds become softer, and the mind gradually shifts away from external activity toward internal awareness. When this shift happens, previously unnoticed thoughts can become much easier to observe. A conversation that felt ordinary earlier in the day may suddenly feel more interesting to examine. The brain begins replaying the moment in order to study the interaction from different perspectives. It may recall the exact words that were spoken. It may reconsider the tone of someone's voice. It may wonder what the other person was thinking during the exchange. From the outside, this process can feel frustrating, especially when you are trying to sleep. Yet inside the brain, something useful is taking place. The mind is quietly refining its understanding of human behavior. Each replay gives the brain another opportunity to interpret the social signals that were present in the moment. Sometimes this leads to a clearer understanding. Other times it simply helps the mind release the experience after examining it more carefully. In many cases, the brain is not searching for perfection. It is simply attempting to understand the situation more completely. And once the mind feels that it has gathered enough insight, the memory usually begins to fade again into the background. This is why the same conversation may replay several times during the night before eventually losing its intensity. The brain slowly finishes its review, and when the process feels complete, the mind finally allows the memory to rest. Another reason conversations feel so vivid at night is connected to the way the brain handles emotional uncertainty. When a social interaction leaves even a small question behind, the mind tends to hold on to it longer than experiences that feel fully understood. During the day, many interactions move past us quickly. A conversation happens, attention shifts, and the moment seems to disappear. Yet the brain quietly records the emotional signals that were present during the exchange. Perhaps someone hesitated before responding. Maybe their reaction was slightly different from what you expected. Or perhaps the conversation ended before you felt the situation was completely resolved. These small moments of uncertainty often remain stored in memory. They are not always strong enough to demand attention immediately, but they remain quietly available for later reflection. When night arrives and the outside world becomes calm, the mind suddenly has far fewer distractions competing for attention. Without constant movement, noise, or conversation, the brain begins turning its focus inward. Thoughts that remained in the background during the day can now move closer to awareness. At this stage, the brain may begin revisiting interactions that contained unresolved emotional signals. It attempts to reconstruct the moment with greater detail. The sequence of the conversation becomes clearer. The tone of the voices becomes easier to recall. Even the emotional atmosphere of the moment may return. From the outside, this can feel like unnecessary overthinking. But internally, the brain is performing a very normal process. It is attempting to understand whether the interaction carried any deeper meaning. Human beings rely heavily on social understanding. Our brains are constantly learning how to interpret the behavior of others. By replaying conversations, the mind slowly improves its ability to navigate future social situations. Each reflection adds a little more understanding. Eventually, the brain gathers enough information to feel satisfied with the interpretation. And when that happens, the memory gradually loses its urgency. The mind no longer feels the need to replay it again. Until then, however, the brain may quietly return to the moment several times during the night. There is another important reason why conversations tend to feel more intense when the mind returns to them at night. The emotional balance of the brain changes as the body prepares for sleep. During the daytime, the mind constantly receives input from the outside world. Light, sound, movement, conversations, and responsibilities all compete for attention. This constant stimulation keeps emotional reactions relatively balanced because attention is always moving forward. But when night arrives, the environment becomes dramatically quieter. External distractions begin to fade. The brain slowly shifts from outward attention to inward awareness. When this happens, thoughts and memories can begin to feel stronger than they did earlier in the day. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a change in cognitive perspective. Without the distractions of daily activity, the mind begins observing its own thoughts more closely. A conversation that seemed small earlier may suddenly appear much more meaningful. The brain begins analyzing details that previously went unnoticed. It may focus on the tone of a sentence. It may reconsider the timing of a response. It may imagine how the other person interpreted the moment. Because the mind now has more space to reflect, these details can feel unusually vivid. At night, the brain is also more sensitive to emotional memory. Moments that carried even a mild emotional signal during the day may become easier to recall when the environment becomes calm. This does not necessarily mean the situation was truly important. It simply means the brain is examining it more carefully. Sometimes this deeper reflection leads to useful understanding. The mind might realize that a moment was misinterpreted. It may recognize that a small worry was unnecessary. Or it may simply acknowledge that the conversation has already passed and no longer requires attention. But until that sense of understanding appears, the brain may continue replaying the scene. Each replay becomes part of the mind's attempt to interpret the experience more clearly. Eventually, the emotional intensity begins to soften. The memory loses its urgency, and the mind gradually allows the conversation to fade back into the background of memory. Another reason the mind replays conversations at night is related to how the brain tries to protect social relationships. Human beings have always depended on cooperation with others. For most of human history, belonging to a group increased the chances of survival. Because of this, the brain developed strong systems for monitoring how interactions with other people unfold. These systems constantly search for clues about acceptance, understanding, or disagreement. When a conversation leaves even a small sense of uncertainty, the brain may mark that moment as something worth reviewing later. During the daytime, however, this review process rarely receives full attention. The mind is busy moving from one responsibility to another. New experiences quickly replace older ones. The brain simply stores many social moments without fully analyzing them. But when night time arrives and the outside world becomes quiet, attention naturally shifts inward. Without constant distractions, the mind becomes more aware of thoughts that were previously ignored. A conversation from earlier in the day may suddenly return to awareness. The brain begins replaying the interaction, as if it is searching for additional meaning. It may examine the words that were spoken. It may consider the tone that was used. It may imagine how the other person interpreted the moment. Sometimes the brain even creates alternative versions of the conversation. It may imagine how the situation could have unfolded differently. What might have happened if different words were used, or how the response could have changed the outcome of the interaction. This type of reflection is part of the brain's natural learning process. By reviewing past interactions, the mind slowly improves its ability to navigate future social situations. Although the process can feel uncomfortable while trying to fall asleep, the brain is simply practicing its ability to understand human behavior. And in many cases, once the mind feels it has learned enough from the experience, the conversation gradually loses its intensity. The memory fades. The brain shifts its attention to other thoughts, and the night becomes quiet again. One of the most interesting aspects of nighttime thinking is that the mind often becomes more imaginative when reviewing past conversations. During the day, most thoughts are focused on immediate tasks and real-world situations. Attention moves quickly from one responsibility to another. But when the environment becomes quiet at night, the brain begins operating in a more reflective and imaginative state. This shift changes the way memories are experienced. Instead of simply remembering what happened, the mind sometimes begins constructing possibilities around the event. You may find yourself imagining how the other person interpreted your words. You may wonder whether a sentence sounded different than you intended. Sometimes the brain even begins creating alternative versions of the conversation. You might imagine what would have happened if you had responded differently, or how the interaction might have unfolded if a different tone had been used. This imaginative process can make the memory feel much larger than the original moment actually was. A short conversation that lasted only a few seconds during the day can expand into a much longer mental scene at night. Part of this happens because the brain is trying to predict future social outcomes. Human communication involves constant interpretation. People rarely express every thought directly. Instead, meaning is often communicated through subtle signals and context. Because of this complexity, the brain sometimes explores multiple interpretations of the same interaction. It tests different possibilities. It asks quiet questions. What did that reaction mean? Was that pause significant? Did the other person understand what I meant? These questions are part of the brain's effort to refine its social awareness. However, when this process happens late at night, the mind can become temporarily stuck in a loop of reflection. Without outside distractions to interrupt the thought process, the conversation may continue replaying in slightly different forms. Each replay becomes another attempt by the brain to interpret the situation more clearly. Eventually, the mind grows tired of the analysis. The emotional intensity begins to fade, and the conversation slowly returns to its proper size and memory. What once felt important begins to feel distant again. The brain quietly accepts the experience and moves forward. Another reason nighttime thinking can become so persistent is connected to how the brain evaluates possible social mistakes. Human beings are naturally sensitive to moments that feel slightly uncertain in social situations. Even small interactions can leave behind a quiet question in the mind. Perhaps a sentence was misunderstood. Maybe a response felt slightly awkward. Or perhaps the conversation ended before you felt completely confident about how it went. During the day, these small uncertainties are usually easy to ignore. The mind quickly moves forward to the next activity. But when the outside world becomes quiet at night, those unfinished questions can slowly return to awareness. The brain begins examining the moment more carefully. It may replay the conversation in its original form. Then it may begin asking subtle questions about what the other person might have been thinking. Did they interpret the comment the way it was intended? Did they notice something that you did not? Could the situation have been handled differently? These thoughts are not necessarily signs that something went wrong. They are simply the brain's way of checking whether a social interaction requires further understanding. Because humans rely heavily on relationships, the brain treats social information as important. It prefers to review uncertain interactions rather than ignore them completely. This is why certain conversations can feel more noticeable at night. The brain is attempting to finish a process that remained incomplete earlier in the day. It wants to understand the interaction clearly before letting it fade into the background of memory. Most of the time, once the brain feels satisfied with its interpretation, the replaying naturally slows down. The mind gradually stops returning to the moment. The memory becomes quieter, and eventually the conversation no longer demands attention. The brain has simply completed its review. One reason conversations feel more intense when the mind revisits them at night is that the brain sometimes begins filling in missing information with imagination. During a real conversation, people rarely communicate every thought directly. Much of human interaction depends on subtle cues. Tone of voice, timing, facial expressions, and pauses often carry meaning that words alone do not fully explain. Because these signals happen quickly, the brain does not always interpret them completely in the moment. Instead, it records the experience and continues processing it later. When the mind becomes quiet at night, the brain may return to the interaction and begin trying to interpret these subtle signals more carefully. It may ask questions about what the other person might have been thinking. It may try to understand whether a response carried a deeper meaning. Sometimes the brain even begins imagining explanations for details that were never fully clear. A brief pause in the conversation may suddenly feel significant. A short response may seem more serious than it originally appeared. This happens because the mind is naturally uncomfortable with uncertainty. When information feels incomplete, the brain often attempts to fill the gap. At night, when the mind has fewer distractions, this process becomes easier to notice. The brain begins constructing possibilities in order to explain what happened. It may replay the scene while adjusting small details. It may imagine different interpretations of the other person's reaction. Most of these imagined explanations are simply possibilities, not facts. But while the brain is exploring them, the memory can feel unusually vivid. This is why nighttime reflection sometimes makes conversations appear more dramatic than they actually were. The mind is not only remembering the moment, It is also experimenting with interpretations. Eventually, as the brain continues reviewing the interaction, it usually reaches a simpler understanding. The imagined explanations fade. A conversation returns to its original size in memory, and the mind gradually recognizes that the moment was far less complicated than it initially appeared during the quiet of the night. Another reason conversations can feel unusually important at night is related to the way the brain processes emotional memory when the body begins preparing for sleep. Throughout the day, the mind is constantly interacting with the outside world. Attention moves quickly between different tasks, conversations, and responsibilities. Because of this continuous activity, many emotional signals are only partially processed in the moment they occur. A brief interaction may leave a small impression in memory without being fully understood right away. The brain records the event and quietly stores it for later reflection. When nighttime arrives and the environment becomes quieter, the mind begins shifting into a different mode of awareness. External stimulation decreases, and attention slowly turns inward. This shift allows certain memories from the day to become more noticeable. The brain may begin revisiting moments that carried emotional meaning, even if that meaning was subtle. A short conversation, a pause in someone's response, or a change in tone can all become small signals that the mind chooses to examine later. During this nighttime reflection, the brain often tries to understand the situation more completely. It may replay the interaction step by step. It may consider how the conversation unfolded. It may explore how each person involved might have interpreted the moment. This process can feel frustrating when you are trying to sleep, but it is actually part of a natural mental function. Human memory is not simply a system for recording events. It is also a system designed to improve understanding and guide future behavior. By revisiting social experiences, the brain gradually refines its ability to interpret complex human interactions. Each time the mind reviews the moment, it gathers a little more information. Eventually, the brain begins to feel that the situation has been understood well enough. When that happens, the memory usually loses its urgency. The conversation slowly fades back into the background of thought, and the mind becomes quiet again. Another important reason conversations replay at night is connected to the way the human brain protects social relationships. For thousands of years, survival depended heavily on cooperation with other people. Living within a group meant access to protection, shared resources, and mutual support. Because of this, the brain developed very sensitive systems for monitoring social interactions. These systems constantly observe how conversations unfold. They quietly analyze tone, reactions, timing, and emotional signals that appear during communication. Most of the time, this process happens automatically in the background. While a conversation is happening, the brain collects information about how the interaction is progressing. However, the full meaning of that interaction is not always clear immediately. Sometimes the brain stores the experience and continues examining it later. Nighttime often becomes the moment when this deeper analysis begins. When the outside world becomes quiet, the mind naturally turns inward. Without constant stimulation from the environment, internal thoughts become easier to notice. This is when earlier conversations may return to awareness. The brain begins reviewing the interaction in greater detail. It may replay the moment step by step, It may examine how each sentence was spoken. It may consider how the other person might have interpreted certain words. During this process, the brain is essentially asking a simple question. Did this interaction affect an important relationship? If the answer feels uncertain, the mind may continue revisiting the conversation several times. This repetition is not necessarily a sign that something went wrong. In many cases, the brain is simply making sure it fully understands the social meaning of the event. Once the mind feels confident that the interaction has been understood clearly, the memory usually loses its urgency. The brain no longer feels the need to review the moment again, and gradually the conversation fades back into the background of memory where it belongs. One reason conversations can feel unusually important during the quiet of the night is related to the way the brain evaluates possible social mistakes. Human beings naturally pay close attention to situations where communication may not have gone exactly as expected. Even a small moment of uncertainty can remain in memory for longer than a completely comfortable interaction. For example, a brief pause in someone's response might leave a subtle question in the mind. A sentence that felt slightly awkward may linger in memory. Or perhaps the conversation ended before you felt fully certain that the message was understood the way you intended. During the daytime, these small moments rarely receive much attention. Life moves quickly from one activity to another. New conversations replace earlier ones. Responsibilities demand focus. Because of this constant movement, the brain often postpones deeper reflection. It records the interaction but continues processing it later. Nighttime creates a very different environment for the mind. When the outside world becomes quieter, attention naturally turns inward. Without constant stimulation, the brain becomes more aware of thoughts that remained unnoticed during the day. This is when earlier conversations can quietly return to awareness. The brain begins examining the interaction more carefully. It may replay the moment step by step. It may recall how the conversation began. It may reconsider how each person responded. Sometimes the mind even begins imagining alternative versions of the exchange. It may wonder what would have happened if a different sentence had been spoken, or how the conversation might have changed if the tone had been slightly different. This process is part of the brain's attempt to learn from social experiences. By reviewing past interactions, the mind gradually improves its ability to understand and navigate future conversations. Although this reflection can feel frustrating when trying to sleep, it is often the brain's quiet effort to refine social awareness. Eventually, the mind gathers enough understanding from the memory. The questions become less important. The emotional intensity begins to fade, and the conversation slowly returns to its normal place within memory. As the night becomes quieter, the mind often begins to loosen its grip on the thoughts it was holding earlier. The conversation that once felt important slowly loses its sharpness. Details that seemed very clear a few minutes ago begin to soften. The brain naturally grows tired of repeating the same moment again and again. This is a normal part of how attention works. At first, the mind may replay a memory many times, searching for meaning. But over time, the energy behind that memory begins to fade. Thoughts become slower. Images become less precise. The conversation that once felt vivid may now appear more distant, almost like a scene fading into the background. The mind begins to realize that nothing needs to be solved in this moment. The conversation has already happened. The day has already ended, and the night continues quietly around you. Breathing becomes steady again. The body remains still, supported by the surface beneath you. Without the pressure to understand every detail, the mind gradually begins to rest. The memory that once returned again and again slowly loses its importance, and as the brain releases its focus on that moment, other thoughts begin to fade as well. The quiet of the night gently takes their place. By now, the mind has spent enough time examining the conversation. The details no longer feel as sharp as they did before. The memory begins to soften. Thoughts move more slowly. There is less urgency to understand every part of what happened. The brain naturally begins releasing its focus. This is how attention works. It can only hold on to the same thought for so long before it gradually lets go. As that happens, the mind becomes quieter. The conversation that once felt important begins to feel distant, like a small scene from earlier in the day, something that happened and then passed. There is nothing left to change about that moment, nothing left to solve tonight. The day is already complete, and the night continues moving forward in its quiet rhythm. Your breathing remains calm. Your body stays comfortably still. The room around you remains peaceful and dark. Without the need to analyze anything further, the mind slowly begins to relax. Thoughts drift more gently now. They appear and then disappear. The conversation that once replayed so clearly fades further into the background, and the quiet of the night begins to fill the space it leaves behind. The night has become very quiet now. Most of the thoughts that were active earlier have already begun to fade. The conversation that once returned again and again no longer feels as important as it did before. It slowly moves further away, like a memory drifting into the distance. The mind no longer feels the need to examine every detail. There is nothing left to figure out, nothing left to solve. The moment has already passed, and the mind naturally begins to release it. Breathing continues softly, slow and steady. The body rests comfortably, supported by the surface beneath you. The room around you remains calm and still. Darkness gently fills the space. Thoughts may still appear from time to time, but they come more slowly now, and they leave just as quietly. There is no need to follow them. They can simply pass through awareness and disappear again. As the mind grows quieter, the body continues drifting toward deeper rest. The night moves forward peacefully, and the silence around you becomes more and more complete. The night continues quietly. Nothing around you needs attention now. The conversation from earlier has already faded. It belongs to the past, and the mind no longer needs to hold on to it. Thoughts become softer, further apart. Sometimes a small idea may appear for a moment, but it quickly dissolves back into the quiet. Your breathing remains slow and natural. The body feels heavy and relaxed, completely supported. The room stays peaceful, dark, still. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to understand tonight. The day is finished, and the mind can finally rest. As the quiet grows deeper, awareness slowly begins to drift. Thoughts become lighter, less clear, almost like distant echoes. The night carries them away, and little by little the mind settles into the calm rhythm of sleep.